What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the wide receiver position for week 5 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing to the channel. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we got the Colts at the Broncos. I've got Michael Pittman downgraded to a flex. He missed week 2, so we're not really able to get the best picture overall, but he is sitting at wide receiver number 35 in full PPR at the moment. A 27.1 performance in week 1 against Houston, a 15.2 performance in week 3 against Kansas City, then just 6.1 fantasy points in week 4 versus Tennessee. He should draw Pat Surtain for most of this game, and the Colts offense, who is more than likely going to be without Jonathan Taylor on Thursday night, is not looking too intimidating. So I've got Pittman downgraded to a flex overall. Still think he has an opportunity to have a good game at any time, but I'm a little bit worried about this offense as a whole, and I don't love the matchup for Pittman going into Thursday night. Courtland Sutton at this point in the season, especially in full PPR leagues, is a must start on a weekly basis. He is the #1 target for Russell Wilson. He is the only trusted Broncos player in my eyes on this offense overall from a fantasy perspective. 11.2 points in week 1, 19.7 in week 2, 17.7 in week 3, 16.2 in week 4. Your wide receiver number 11 overall. He is an absolute must start regardless of matchups, especially in full PPR, like I said, so I like him moving into week 5. Jerry Jeudy, on the other hand, comes in as your wide receiver number 44. He's been a lot more inconsistent. 20.2 fantasy points in week 1, 2.2 in week 2, 3.7 in week 3, and then 15.3 in week 4 against the Raiders. Did have a nice outing, and he did find the end zone this past week. Just due to the overall inconsistency, I've got Jeudy listed as a flex option, but I still think he's a pretty decent flex option overall, especially with Javonte Williams going down and the Denver Broncos being forced to figure out what they're going to do at the running back position between Latavius Murray, Melvin Gordon, and Mike Boone. I like both these receivers overall heading into Thursday night football. All right, Giants at Packers. I've got the Giants wide receivers as sits without a doubt. I told you guys to not start any of them last week. Not that I thought many of you guys were considering starting any of the Giants receivers last week, but I didn't mention there's a possibility in deeper leagues to take a chance on Richie James, who should be the #1 receiver for the Giants with the injury to Sterling Shepard, and that did not pay off if you guys went for that or were desperate enough to go for that. Richie James had -1 fantasy points in week 4. Rondell Robinson was out. David Sills had 1.5 points. Kenny Golladay had 0 fantasy points. Darius Slayton had 2.1 fantasy points. There's really no more of a discussion to be had here. There are no viable options at the wide receiver position on the Giants offense. Moving on to the Packers, I've got Allen Lazard as a start. Double-digit fantasy performances in his last 2 weeks, and he has 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games going up against a Giants defense that is pretty lackadaisy. So I like Lazard going into this week. He has definitely solidified himself as the #1 option for Aaron Rodgers, which is definitely going to continue to be very important. But I do think that Romeo Doubs is starting to solidify himself as the #2 option next to Lazard, and Doubs brings some nice upside on a weekly basis. 20.3 fantasy points in week 3, 12.7 in week 4, and he gets his Giants defense as well as Allen Lazard. So I like Doubs as a flex option, especially in full PPR formats moving into week 5. All right, Lions at Patriots. Man, is this Lions offense just continuing to hum regardless of injuries. Even if they are losing, right? They still look great from a pure fantasy perspective. AMON-RA St. Brown, after missing week 4, still comes in as your wide receiver 7 in full PPR. If he is healthy for this game, he continues to be a must start. He still has the second most points per game at the wide receiver position, while only playing 3 out of 4 games on the season at 24.4 points per game. Cooper Kupp is the only wide receiver ahead of AMON-RA St. Brown in points scored per game. I love AMON-RA St. Brown. He is a must start on a weekly basis as long as he's healthy. He's got an asterisk because still don't know if he's going to be healthy here in week 5, and the Lions do have a bye week in week 6, so it's possible they sit DeAndre Swift again and AMON-RA St. Brown again, and even DJ Chark again. But coming off of the loss against Seattle, it's also possible that these players are back out there with this offense. DJ Chark, I still don't have an answer on if he is going to be healthy, but really I didn't even put him on today's list because he's been so incredibly inconsistent. You can always take a chance on him, sure, but quite frankly, I'd rather go with Josh Reynolds, who I've got as a flex on uptick in usage overall in week 4. But overall, in 3 out of his last 4 games, he's had double-digit fantasy performances in full PPR. So I continue to like Josh Reynolds, who has a great chemistry with Jared Goff, as a solid flex option, especially in full PPR scoring formats. All right, the Patriots offense is an absolute disaster right now. You got Bailey Zappi playing quarterback last week after Brian Hoyer went down. I don't know if Mac Jones is going to be ready for week 5. I don't know who's going to be their quarterback. But at the end of the day, DeVante Parker has been your most productive player from a fantasy standpoint at the wide receiver position for the Patriots over the last 2 weeks. 10.4 fantasy points in week 4, 20.6 in week 3. So I think if you're absolutely desperate in a deep league, you can consider flexing Parker. But keep in mind, he only had 2 targets, 2 receptions last week, but one of them was a touchdown. So if you remove the touchdown, it's a very bad stat line. But like I said, if you're desperate enough in a deep enough league, full PPR, you can take a chance on DeVante Parker. For the majority of fantasy owners, I don't think he's a phenomenal flex whatsoever. All right, Chargers at Browns. I am starting Keenan Allen if he is healthy. He is still considered day to day. I still have faith in Keenan Allen overall, but we've just got to see him get on the field. If you guys want to see how he performs in week 5, if he is listed as healthy and does play, then that's fine to just give him a week to get worked back into the offense. But I have faith in Keenan Allen. As long as he's fully healthy, he will be productive on the season, so he gets an asterisk for today's video. Mike Williams continues to be a start for me. Now, he's obviously a start for sure if Keenan Allen sits this game out. He is more of a flex potential if Keenan Allen plays, but regardless, he brings enough upside on a weekly basis that he should be a starter on your roster, whether that's at the wide receiver 2 position for your roster or the flex position. I still believe in Mike Williams as a great boomer bust option on a weekly basis. All right, Josh Palmer had a very disappointing week 4 against Houston after having double-digit fantasy performances in his last 2 games where Keenan Allen did sit out. So I think you keep an eye on Josh Palmer. Don't get too crazy here. He disappointed us in week 4. We saw that consistent timeline finally take a break. But I do think in deeper leagues, if Keenan Allen does not play in this game, you can consider Josh Palmer against the Browns. All right, let's talk about Amari Cooper, who was on fire to start the season. Outside of week 1, where he had 4.7 fantasy points, but those next 2 weeks, right, against the Jets, 25.1 points in week 2, against the Steelers, 23.1 points in week 3. I liked him a lot against Atlanta, but he really did disappoint us. I do think, although the Atlanta defense is a team that we think of being a weak overall team, they're actually playing pretty good football, and AJ Terrell is not a cornerback to mess with. Overall, Amari Cooper had 4 targets and just 1 reception for 9 receiving yards. With all that being said, I like him here in week 5. I think you can consider him a start, but he's perfectly fine in the flex if you are more confident in your wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 spots. I do think it's probably realistic that we're going to see some inconsistency out of Amari Cooper on the season, but overall, I think he's a perfectly fine start if you don't have better options moving into week 5. All right, Texans at Jaguars. Brandon Cooks is a flex for me. 15.2 fantasy points in week 1, 9.4 in week 2, 4.2 in week 3, and 18.7 in week 4. He's your wide receiver number 36 in full PPR. The Jaguars defense is not a defense to be toyed with. We just talked about the Falcons. There are a lot of defenses really surprising us this year, and the Jaguars is one of them, although they get most of it done up front. So I think if you don't have better options, Brandon Cooks continues to be a perfectly fine flex, although there's definitely some inconsistency overall in his stat lines on the season. All right, Christian Kirk of the Jaguars, I think, is a great start moving into week 5. He's your wide receiver 10 in full PPR, 17.7 points in week 1, 25.8 in week 2, 19.2 in week 3. Then he kind of came back to earth against the Philadelphia Eagles like a lot of us feared he would at 8.3 fantasy points. He had 9 targets, just 2 receptions, 60 receiving yards overall. I still believe in Christian Kirk. I still believe in the Jaguars offense. I know they had a really rough week against Philadelphia, but all around Philadelphia, you could argue is the best team in the league right now. They're easily in the top 3. The Houston Texans are not the Philadelphia Eagles. I have a lot of faith in not just Christian Kirk this week, but the Jacksonville Jaguars offense as a whole. I would watch the rest of the Jaguars offense. Zay Jones should be ready for week 5, but he may not be ready. I do think that Zay Jones is a wide receiver you can flex. Jamal Agnew went crazy in week 4 against the Eagles. He had 2 touchdowns, 50 receiving yards off of 4 receptions, 21 fantasy points. He was productive at times last year in fantasy football, but if Zay Jones plays this game, I think you definitely take a step back from Agnew. Marvin Jones had just 1 target in week 4 and 0 receptions. So I think we keep an eye on this receiving core: Marvin Jones, Jamal Agnew, and Zay Jones. I probably have the most faith in Zay Jones, but overall, for the Jacksonville Jaguars moving into week 5, Christian Kirk is going to be the player to start. All right, Falcons at Buccaneers. Listen, Drake London had a very bad week after having double-digit fantasy points in his first 3 weeks of the season. 3.7 points against Cleveland in week 4. 7 targets, just 2 receptions for 17 receiving yards. Marcus Mariota starting to look really shaky at the quarterback position, but Cordero Patterson is out for the next 4 weeks, which will add some targets to Drake London's share. So I think he continues to be a solid flex overall. The targets should be there for London, and he did prove enough to us in those first 3 weeks of the season that he is a viable starter, especially in full PPR leagues. All right, Mike Evans was suspended in week 3, had a down week in week 2 against Marshawn Lattimore, and the Saints had a perfectly fine fantasy performance in week 1 at 18.1 fantasy points. Then he went absolutely ballistic against the Kansas City Chiefs in week 4, 30.3 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 receptions, 103 receiving yards, and 2 scores. You are starting Mike Evans if you own him. You drafted him to be a weekly starter, so he should be in your lineups, and he has done enough. Missing 1 game on the season due to suspension, he is still wide receiver 18 in full PPR. Chris Godwin came back and played after being injured in week 1 against Dallas and missing weeks 2 and 3. He played perfectly fine against the Kansas City Chiefs in week 4. He may pop up on the injury report this week. He did get a little banged up in the second half of the game on Sunday, but overall it was not related to the injuries that kept him out weeks 2 and 3, and he should be good to go according to everything that I have read. He had 10 targets, 7 receptions, 59 receiving yards in week 4, 12.9 fantasy points, so he is a solid start in full PPR leagues. I do think that Evans and Godwin are the receivers you want to start on this offense. Julio Jones, just 1.7 points in week 4. Russell Gage, 4.4 points. It is obvious that the receivers that Tom Brady wants to throw to are Evans and Godwin, and those are my starts moving into week 5. All right, Steelers at Bills. Listen, the Bills secondary is definitely banged up at the safety position, but overall on the season, they are still playing good defensive football. I don't quite know what the Steelers offense is going to look like with Kenny Pickett at the quarterback position. It's a tough matchup. It's a tough environment going up against one of the best teams in the league. He is going to be playing from behind more than likely in this games. So I still like Deontay Johnson as a flex, but I would tamper your expectations in terms of a ceiling. Just 4.2 fantasy points in week 4 after having double-digit fantasy points in full PPR in the first 3 weeks of the season. He is your wide receiver 40 in full PPR. I say give Johnson a chance if you don't have better options. If you do, you might want to consider sitting him. But like I said, the game script here could allow for a lot of passing attempts from Kenny Pickett, so I'm not completely out on Deontay Johnson. Chase Claypool is a sit for me, your wide receiver number 75 in full PPR. Has not really been a fantasy factor all season. I think George Pickens, who has good chemistry with Kenny Pickett, which was shown on the field on Sunday, is worth starting, right? 16.2 fantasy points in week 4, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 102 receiving yards. Once again, that game script last week allowed for a lot of passing attempts by the Steelers. I think you could see a similar game script this week. So I think Pickens is a solid flex if you don't have better options. I do think he brings some nice upside to the table as well. But if you want to kind of sit back and see how Pickett and the Steelers perform this week, I think that's okay. I think it's perfectly okay to bench Johnson and Pickens if you feel like you have better options overall. Looking at the Buffalo Bills wide receivers, we do have a couple dynamics to talk about here. Stefon Diggs is your wide receiver 2 in full PPR. He's an absolute animal. I know his ceilings haven't been as high the last 2 weeks. 10.2 points against Baltimore, 14.4 against Miami. After the 44-point performance in week 2 and the 26-point performance in week 1. But regardless, you are starting Diggs if you own him. There's no discussion to be had there. Gabe Davis, on the other hand, 18.8 fantasy points in week 1. Missed week 2, 6.7 points in week 3, 2.3 against Baltimore in week 4. I don't know if he is fully healthy, but he was healthy enough to suit up. Overall, Gabe Davis is a player I'm sitting in week 5. I want to see a more consistent pattern emerge. He's starting to look a little bit like a Mike Williams-esque player who brings us some really high ceilings, but potentially has some weeks where he's dealing with injury and struggling and becoming more of a boom or bust play, when a lot of us in the offseason thought Gabe Davis would be a very consistent play and part of this offense. I want to see something more consistent come overall before I'm confident in starting Gabe Davis. So for me, he's a sit in week 5, but you do have to understand, anytime you bench one of these Bills skill position players, they can go off, but I do think it is best to set Gabe Davis here in week 5. All right, Isaiah McKenzie is currently in concussion protocol. If he is deemed good to go, I like McKenzie as a flex. I really do. 3 touchdowns in the first 4 games of the season. So I like McKenzie. I think he's a wide receiver to consider starting over Gabe Davis at the moment. He has been the better trend overall. He doesn't need a lot of targets to get it done either. He's looked good the last 2 weeks, especially 12.1 points against Baltimore, 21.2 against Miami, just 5.7 in week 2, but 9.9 including a touchdown in week 1. So I actually like Isaiah McKenzie if he's good to go. I would rather start McKenzie than Gabe Davis moving into week 5. All right, Dolphins at Jets. I would continue to start Tyreek Hill. I think he will be just fine with Teddy Bridgewater at the quarterback position. He had 14 targets last week, 10 receptions, 160 receiving yards, 25.9 fantasy points. He is your wide receiver 3 in full PPR scoring formats. I continue to start Tyreek Hill if he is on your team, no matter what. Jalen Waddle is still your wide receiver 5 in full PPR, but he saw a little bit of a dip in production with Teddy Bridgewater at the quarterback position. We know he has phenomenal chemistry with Tua, so I'm a little bit worried about Waddle, but I'm only going to downgrade him to a flex. The ceiling is still too high, and Bridgewater was thrown into this game. Maybe with the week of practice, we see more production out of Waddle in week 5. I am not ready to sit Jalen Waddle, so I think he is a good flex option moving into week 5 without a doubt. Let's talk about the Jets wide receivers, who I warned you guys about last week. I was a little bit worried about the change at the quarterback position from Flacco to Zach Wilson. How is this necessarily going to affect the Jets skill position players? I frankly thought Elijah Moore would have a better game overall. He came in at 8.5 fantasy points, so really nothing different than what we've seen on the season. Corey Davis really benefited from Zach Wilson at the quarterback position, although he did have double-digit fantasy performances in 2 out of the 3 previous games, but he came in with his season high at 18.4 fantasy points in week 4, 74 receiving yards, and a touchdown off 5 receptions. On the other hand, I really warned you guys, I don't quite know what's going to happen with Garrett Wilson at the receiver position. I'm hoping this is just a 1-week dip in production. He still had 6 targets, but just 2 receptions for 41 receiving yards. So I will continue to keep an eye on Garrett Wilson. Don't panic and drop him. I was surprised Elijah Moore didn't have a more productive day, and Corey Davis looks good. So I still think you can flex any of those 3 receivers overall. I just don't know who's going to be Zach Wilson's #1 guy. Like I said, Garrett Wilson 6 targets, Elijah Moore 4 targets, Corey Davis 7 targets. We need a larger sample size overall from this offense with Zach Wilson as he's starting quarterback before we can make confident start and sit calls. All right, Bears at Vikings. I'm going to continue to sit Darnell Mooney. I know he had a good week 4 against the Giants, 13.4 fantasy points after not scoring more than 4.3 fantasy points in the first 3 weeks of the season. 5 targets, 4 receptions, 94 receiving yards. Full PPR was a very good stat line, but I just need to see a more consistent pattern emerge. And I think that Minnesota's defense is in a really good position. I like the game script for the Vikings. I don't like the game script for Justin Fields and the Bears offense. I loved Mooney in the offseason, guys, but I don't have a lot of confidence in him at this point in the season. Justin Jefferson is your wide receiver 4 in full PPR, 31 fantasy points in week 4. He now has at least half of his games played scoring 30 or more fantasy points. He is a must-start on a weekly basis. This ceiling is just too high. Beg you guys, don't panic on JJ with a 4.4 performance against Detroit in week 3. He has to stay in your starting lineups on a weekly basis. Adam Thielen is starting to give us a consistent pattern. 18.1 fantasy points in week 3, 15.2 in week 4, after 6.6 in week 1 and 9.2 in week 2. Just don't forget, Thielen is one of Kirk Cousins' favorite targets in the red zone and probably one of his favorite targets in general. So I think that Adam Thielen, especially in full PPR formats, continues to be a flex play and a perfectly fine flex play against the Bears moving into week 5. All right, Titans at Commanders. I will continue to flex Robert Woods, but no more than that. Although when we look at the last 2 weeks, they have been productive. 12.5 fantasy points in week 3, 13 in week 4. He did find the end zone in week 4. So I'm not in love with this offense outside of Derrick Henry. I'm not in love with the passing game for the Titans, but the Commanders have been pretty vulnerable in terms of their passing defense. So I think that Robert Woods continues to be a solid flex, and he's really the only player you can consider at the wide receiver position for the Titans. I thought maybe we were starting to get something out of Treylon Burks, but we're going to have to pump the brakes there. He's not been productive from a fantasy standpoint. Looking at the Commanders, Scary Terry had an awful week in week 4. He got absolutely locked down. I mean, that Cowboys defense continues to be a problem to the rest of the league, but Tennessee's defense is not the Cowboys defense. I like Terry McLaurin headed in to week 5 just fine, especially at the wide receiver 2 position or your flex. I would not be too concerned. Curtis Samuel continues to be a start for me. Similar to McLaurin, I think you can flex Curtis Samuel. I think they're fine as starts just because of the matchup, but if you're more confident leaving them in the flex position because you don't have a lot of faith in the Commanders, that's fine. Curtis Samuel's seen a little bit of a dip in production since those higher ceilings in the first 2 weeks of the season, but I think overall he'll be just fine. Jahan Dotson is expected to miss 1 to 2 weeks, so he's not listed in today's video. Whenever he is back, we'll continue to talk about Dotson, who I think could have had a productive game against the Titans as well. But moving into week 5, I've got McLaurin and Curtis Samuel as starts or flex options for you, and Robert Woods as a flex in this matchup. All right, Seahawks at Saints. I'm starting DK Metcalf, 21.9 fantasy points against the Lions in week 4. I get it's a tough matchup. He gets Marshawn Lattimore. I get it, but Metcalf plays well against #1 corners. And I think at this point in the season, if you own DK Metcalf, like, you're just starting him, especially in full PPR. Like, you're just riding or dying with Metcalf, and I think you just continue to do so. I own him in the only league I'm undefeated in so far on the season. I'm just going to start him every week because the 1 week I benched him was week 3 against Atlanta. And honestly, Geno Smith is playing good enough football that you can have confidence in DK Metcalf on a weekly basis. And speaking of receivers on this team, you can have confidence in, well, Tyler Lockett is wide receiver 24 in full PPR. Metcalf is wide receiver 23. So if we're going to have confidence in Metcalf, you might as well have confidence in Lockett, who has at least 12 fantasy points or more in 3 out of the 4 games on the season so far. And I like Lockett. I think both are perfectly fine as starts moving into week 5. All right, let's talk about these Saints receivers who had Andy Dalton throwing the football to them in week 4. And I was a little bit concerned overall about this offense. I was a little bit concerned about Chris Olave. I told you guys I'm not out on Olave in week 4, but maybe if you have better options, you sit him just because the ceiling's not going to be too high. The Andy Dalton at quarterback, well, Chris Olave is your wide receiver 17 in full PPR, and he continues to be productive on a week in and week out basis. I was wrong in week 4. 16.7 fantasy points. Nothing too crazy, but his second best performance of the season so far. 7 targets, 4 receptions, and his first touchdown on the year in London against the Vikings with Andy Dalton at the quarterback position. So I think Chris Olave has solidified himself as a receiver we are going to start on a weekly basis. Where you drafted him, it's very possible he's your flex player on a weekly basis, which is beautiful. He's been incredibly productive on the season thus far. He is the receiver in my eyes to start for the Saints. But let's talk about Michael Thomas, who may or may not be ready for week 5 after sitting out week 4 and just started the season those first 2 weeks on absolute fire. 22.7 points in week 1, 18.5 in week 2. A little bit of a dip in production against Carolina in week 3 at 9.9, and then missed week 4. He gets Seattle here in week 5. If he is healthy, if he's ready to go, I do like Michael Thomas as a start moving into week 5. All right, 49ers at Panthers. I'm starting Deebo Samuel, his best fantasy performance of the season in week 4. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 115 receiving yards, a touchdown, 23.7 fantasy points. He has had double-digit fantasy points in every game on the season so far. Wide receiver number 16 in full PPR. I continue to like Deebo as a start on a week in, week out basis. Brandon Ayuk, I loved as a flex last week against a Rams defense that's been very bad against the pass, but he came out with just 7.7 fantasy points, 37 receiving yards, 4 targets, 4 receptions. Listen, I think Ayuk holds a pretty nice ceiling, but really we just haven't seen it. I really thought in week 4 we might see it, but so far on the season he has not scored more than 12.9 fantasy points. He gets Carolina here in week 5. They're not great. They're not awful. I don't think Ayuk is more than a flex. Deebo is definitely the receiver I want to start on this team. Speaking of the Panthers, I'm not confident in the wide receiver position for the Panthers whatsoever. DJ Moore, 8 fantasy points in week 1, 13.3 in week 2, 2.5 in week 3, 12.1 in week 4. And it's not that I'm not confident in DJ Moore. Don't get me wrong. I'm just not confident in Baker Mayfield at the quarterback position producing productive fantasy wide receivers. DJ Moore is just a gamble on a week in, week out basis. He's wide receiver number 51 in full PPR. I just am disappointed in what we've seen in DJ Moore, who does have at least 6 targets in every game this year. Had 11 targets last week, but I just don't know if we can trust this pattern overall. If you have to start a Panthers receiver, it's definitely DJ Moore, but I don't know, guys. I'm just not confident with this offense with Baker Mayfield at the quarterback position. And the Niners defense has looked phenomenal through the first 4 weeks of the season. So in my eyes, I would rather sit the Panthers receivers moving into week 5. All right, Eagles at Cardinals. I'm starting AJ Brown. There's no question about it. Your wide receiver 9 in full PPR, 14.5 fantasy points against Jacksonville, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 95 receiving yards. AJ Brown's playing lights out football. The Philadelphia Eagles are playing lights out football. It's going to be a short one for me. DeVonta Smith is still a start for me, but you could definitely consider him as a flex player on a weekly basis because we haven't seen the most consistent pattern whatsoever on the season. 0 points in week 1, 15 in week 2, 30.9 in week 3, 4.7 in week 4, he's a little all over the place, but I'm a huge fan of DeVonta Smith. I think he will be productive on this season, but he might bring that boom or bust potential on a weekly basis. We've already seen that through the first 4 weeks of the season. So I've got him as a start because I love this matchup. I think it's a fun shootout game on the horizon here between both offenses, but you could definitely consider Smith as more of a flex player, and likely where you drafted him, he probably is a flex player for you regardless. All right, Hollywood Brown of the Arizona Cardinals is your wide receiver 6 in full PPR, 14.3 points in week 1, 12.8 in week 2, 28 in week 3, 20.8 in week 4. He is going to be a must start on a weekly basis. I think even when DeAndre Hopkins comes back, Kyler and Marquise Brown have a good enough connection, a good enough chemistry dating back to their college days that Brown is still going to be very productive, especially in full PPR scoring formats. You just got to start him on a weekly basis, and I love this matchup in terms of a game script. I get that Philadelphia is a very strong defense. I get that Darius Slay is playing very good football, but Hollywood Brown should see the targets in this game to make him a start, moving it to week 5. All right, Cowboys at Rams. I'm starting CeeDee Lamb. I'm really glad that I was able to convince a lot of you guys to not panic on CeeDee Lamb after Dak went out for a couple weeks. Dak might be ready in week 5. He might not. But honestly, if we're just evaluating CeeDee Lamb, doesn't really matter. Him and Cooper Rush have been just fine. 15.1 points in week 2, 22.7 in week 3, 21.7 in week 4. His 2 scores in the last 3 weeks in those games where Cooper Rush was the starting quarterback. So yeah, it continues to start CeeDee Lamb. Even if he draws Jalen Ramsey for the majority of this game, the Rams defense overall has been very bad against the pass. You just have to start CeeDee Lamb. The targets will be there. All right, Michael Gallup with his first game of the season, coming back from injury at 10.4 fantasy points in full PPR. Did find the end zone. If he didn't, it would have been a much worse fantasy stat line. But I think Michael Gallup and Noah Brown are both solid flex options, especially in full PPR scoring formats. I don't love them as much in standard because then you're crossing your fingers they score half PPR. They probably have enough appeal, but Gallup and Brown are flex options for me. Lamb is an absolute start. Overall, like I said though, you want to consider Gallup and Brown because this Rams defense has been awful against the pass outside of Jalen Ramsey. All right, Cooper Kupp is your wide receiver 1 in full PPR. No surprise there. He's a must start on a weekly basis. Do we really need to have the conversation? 31.8 fantasy points in week 1, 30.8 in week 2, 16.4 in week 3, 26.2 in week 4. He has been essentially matchup proof, defense proof. I'm not worried about him against Dallas. You are starting Cooper Kupp no matter what. I'm not starting any other receiver on this team. I'm sitting Allen Robinson. He's your wide receiver number 72. He's been a major disappointment here in 2022. He's a sit for me. Cooper Kupp is an undoubted start for me moving it to week 5. All right, Bengals at Ravens. I'm starting Jamar Chase. Listen, guys, I know there's been some panic in the fantasy community around Jamar Chase. He's still your wide receiver number 13 in full PPR. He still has double-digit fantasy performances in every game this season in full PPR. He's still a start for me. He still has phenomenal chemistry with Joe Burrow. He is still a start for me on a weekly basis. I know there's been a lot of buzz about T. Higgins. I do think has the potential to have a higher ceiling on a weekly basis so far. But think about it this way. Jamar Chase, your wide receiver 13 in full PPR. Higgins is your wide receiver 14 in full PPR. So Chase overall is still playing better, but the trend has been in Higgins' favor. Higgins had a bad week in week 1 at 4.7 points, dealing with some injuries and some other things. When in week 2 he had 19.1, week 3 14.3, week 4 against Miami 25.4. So I still love both these receivers, man. They are still both starts for me. I like this matchup. I like this game script. The Ravens defense played better last week against the Bills. They haven't been great on the season. I think Tyler Boyd is due for a good game. 13 points in week 1, 5 in week 2, 20 in week 3, 7 in week 4. He's due for a good game. Tyler Boyd comes out as a good flex for me moving into week 5. Rashad Bateman is day-to-day with a foot injury. I like this matchup here, so if he is healthy, I think you can definitely flex him, although he's been down in the last 2 weeks after having at least 13 fantasy points in his first 2 games of the season. Devin Duvernay had a down week in week 4, but in every other matchup so far on the year, he's had at least 10 fantasy points He is healthy at the moment, so nothing to worry about there. You could see an uptick in targets if Bateman is out. So I think Duvernay is a solid flex as well, moving into week 5. Our Raiders at Chiefs are starting Davante Adams. He is a touchdown in 3 out of the first 4 games of the season. He has at least 7 targets in every game this year. He had 101 receiving yards in week 4 against Denver, 13 targets, 9 receptions, 19.5 fantasy points. He's your wide receiver 8 in full PPR. You're starting Adams on a weekly basis. There's no doubt about it. Warned you guys about Mac Hollins maybe being a bit of a disappointment in week 4. I don't exactly know what to expect out of Hunter Renfrow, who had an absolutely disappointing start to the season, then has missed the next 2 games due to concussion. And I don't know what to expect out of Mac Hollins, who had nearly 30 fantasy points in week 3, then 6.3 in week 4. So I think it's best to just sit back and watch Renfrow and Hollins. Although the Raiders will absolutely do everything they can to keep this game competitive against the Chiefs, but I am in favor of the Chiefs in this matchup. Speaking of the Chiefs wide receivers are not good from a fantasy perspective. I do not want to start any of these wide receivers. Between MVS, McCole Hardman, Sky Moore, and Juju Smith-Schuster, between 4 players through 4 games, we have 1 touchdown scored. We talked about this in last week's video. I do not like these wide receivers from a fantasy perspective. The way the Chiefs are scoring right now is being extremely unique in the red zone. They're looking to guys like Michael Burton, CEH, Travis Kelce, of course, Justin Watson, Noah Gray. I mean, it has just been a really interesting season overall, and the Chiefs are getting really creative. That is what Andy Reid and company are going to do right, but it just so happens that the company that's being left out is the wide receiver position. If you absolutely have to start a Chiefs receiver, I guess it's Juju Smith-Schuster, but I don't like any of them. They are sits for me even against a bad Raiders secondary moving into week 5. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.